Welcome to Phoenix Rising with Dr. Z. This podcast is all about conversations about healing and rising from the ashes of your grief and trauma. In this podcast, we will be deconstructing and highlighting the different aspects of grief and loss. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Zampatella.
Back to it. Were they vaccinated?
Mm-hmm.
There's judgment in that because
Sure.
What are they saying? They are saying that somehow that person chose to die because they weren't vaccinated.
And possibly chose to make other people sick.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's anger, there's judgment, and there was a lot of disenfranchisement with that. And the thing is, even though now, as a society, at least here in the US, we've shifted toward being more accepting of COVID and vaccination versus not, that pain that was inflicted on those grievers is still there because they still bear the bruises of those responses.
Right. So we've got the loss isn't recognized as a loss. We've got the type of loss is stigmatized or not accepted. We've got the relationship was not
We
understood.
haven't covered that one
Okay,
yet.
so let's talk about
So we
that.
said so we've covered that the loss is not a loss.
Not a loss.
Yep.
It's an ambiguous loss.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
The type of the death. And then there's the type of loss. And then with that first one, it said it's not seen as a loss.
It's not
and
seen
that's
as
where
loss.
those two sometimes people fold together.
Well, I understood. There's a lot of overlap.
But I think it's important to keep them distinct just because not seeing it as a loss helps us cover the non-death grief.
Absolutely.
And that's why I like it.
Yeah.
So then the next one is the nature of the relationship that you had with the deceased is not socially sanctioned. Now, I cannot take credit for this example, but I love it, and I'm paraphrasing it. So the perfect example of a relationship where it's not socially sanctioned, which means that your grief is not sanctioned. Classic example is you have a man who's 65 years old, lives in a small town. He's been married since he was about 20, 21. And he's had a mistress since he was about 42, maybe.
Right.
So here he is, he's 65. He's been with his wife faithfully for all of these years. He's been with his mistress for how many decades? He dies suddenly. Now here's what gets really wild. The wife is going to be surrounded by her community.
Sure. And she's going to be allowed to go to the funeral.
She's going to be allowed to dictate the funeral, what it should be. She's going to get support. She may even get more support because he had cheated. Because people are like recognizing she's grieving not just the husband she lost, but the husband she wished he'd been.
And the marriage she wished she had had.
Yes.
Sure.
The children, because of course, every American family, you have 2.5 kids. So those 2.5 kids are now adults. They're grieving the loss of their father. The disenfranchisement here that's especially poignant is of the mistress. She has been in a faithful relationship to this man for a number of years. Small town, everyone knew. Who's going to sanction her grief?
Yeah.
Her friends may be supportive, but in the back of their mind, they're thinking, told you he'd never leave her for you. Her family, you wasted your life on him. Society, you are a homewrecker. And she's sitting here she's doing a psychological autopsy on the relationship in addition to the grief, going, well, you know, he didn't want to leave his wife while the kids were in school. And then they were in college. And then they were getting their first jobs. And then, well, the first grandkids on the way. That's a horrible time. And then maybe the wife had her own health scare. Well, he can't leave his wife when she's going through chemo.
Right.
There can be all of these legitimate reasons why the husband stayed with the wife and the mistress rationalized staying with him even though he wasn't leaving.
Right.
But here's where it's key. She doesn't get FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act. Unless she has vacation time, work's not going to honor her taking time off, assuming she's still employed and working, not retired herself. Her family's not going to be as supportive because they're seeing what could have been. She can't go to that funeral.
Lack of ritual. Bad.
No ritual.
Bad.
And she can't throw her own public ritual.
Right.
And that's the key
There
thing.
are societal functions of rituals and personal functions of rituals, and she doesn't get the societal function of the ritual.
Exactly. And what a societal function for ritual gives us is it pulls people to us. That's what mourning is. It's an outward manifestation that I am in a state of bereavement.
Right.
And those rituals bring people to us. They bring the food to us. They bring interaction. They make sure we're not alone when we're in that acute moment of grief.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this person is absolutely denied it.
Right.
Because of the relationship.
LGBTQ community, absolutely.
That's what that was going to be
professionals, professional caregivers, psychologists, mental health professionals, LCSWs who are working with clients, and we can't go to the funeral. Yeah. We might not even be able to talk to anybody but our own therapist and our malpractice insurance.
There's actually a whole debate on that. So my colleague Ted Hoke and I, and we have Tom Friedman and another gentleman who presented with us, we've presented on what do you do if you lose your client, and what do you do in terms of long-term planning if you die? Do you have an aftercare plan?
Yeah, professional will.
Your professional will.
Sure. So lots of people, relationship not being recognized.
Exactly. And there's debate in the communities. I belong to a couple of listservs, even though I'm not a clinician. For some reason, I'm on clinical listservs. And a bunch of clinicians got into a huge debate a few weeks ago about whether or not you should go to the funeral if you're invited. And there were really good answers on both sides.
I bet.
And
not pretty.
It's not pretty. And that's where that disenfranchisement, it's not only that external, it's also that internal.
Absolutely. Now, how about when the griever isn't recognized as being able to grieve, like a child or a person with a developmental delay or somebody with, dementia or Alzheimer's? Like a whole other category, would you say, of, children don't grieve, they're 5 running around and
I think
they don't get it.
Still fold that into DOCA's original categories.
Okay.
Because in that case, they might put it into that first category of it's not a loss. Well, it's not a loss because they don't remember the person died.
Right.
Or they're not fully aware. Now, I will say I am a big advocate when it comes to children and individuals with developmental disabilities to include them and to tell them. And don't wait till a big reveal.
Right.
If you know grandma's sick, tell them grandma's sick.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a podcast that we recorded, I believe it was yesterday, and we were talking about children and how to include them in the process and how to not hide and use euphemisms and stuff like that. And that was an important, actually, I think the podcast is being split into 2 separate ones because it's such an important topic, and everything you're talking about right now. I'm so glad to hear you saying it because it really does illustrate that those of us in this field are like, no, you can't, please don't do it if it's culturally appropriate. And I throw that on top of a lot of stuff because culture is such an important defining factor. It's a policing factor about what is okay and what is not okay.
I'm going to push back a little bit on one piece of that. I agree wholeheartedly.
Push back.
Except when it comes to protecting kids and individuals with developmental disabilities, whatever is culturally appropriate for the adults to be exposed to, I argue, still include those kids. Still include those adults with developmental disabilities. So I'm not saying what the cultural response should be, but whatever it is for a competent adult, don't hide it from the kids. Don't lie to them. I actually wrote an op-ed earlier this summer on, I think it was called something like Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, and the Easter Bunny, how or Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, and Death, How to Talk to Kids Without Lying. Don't make stuff up.
Right.
They know you're lying. Kids have
or
really...
confuses them.
Yeah, they have really good baloney detectors.
Uh-oh. And then I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, because I'm just aware of our time, that the category I'm also aware of, and I'm looking forward to sharing you, is that the one where the grieving styles are, okay.
That's exactly where I was going to go last.
Okay.
So the last one is that the person's grieving is disenfranchised because it's not fitting whatever is considered to be socially acceptable within that particular environment. And so that can cover a multitude of things. If we have somebody who is an immigrant or a refugee, their grieving style, and when I say style, I don't mean like this or that. I mean their grieving rituals or the emotional expression or lack thereof of the grief may be different. And so people in the community where they've been transplanted doesn't respect, honor, or appreciate what that person is expressing or not expressing. Conversely, it can be if it doesn't fit into whatever, it can be your own culture, it can be your culture of origin, and it's still a mismatch. So that mismatch can be you're very expressive with your grief. It can be that you're not expressive enough, that it's private for you. Somebody who internally processes, they're more likely to work through their emotions and their cognitions internally before they share, because they need to have a handle on what's going on within them before they can take it outside. It's too vulnerable out here. I need to work it here first.
Right.
Conversely, some people are external processors.
Yeah.
Working through it on their own, they're just a little hamster on a wheel. It's not going anywhere. It's just getting faster and faster and faster until they, pass out from exhaustion and then start over again. So it can be that. It can also be instrumental versus intuitive. So an instrumental person is someone who really processes the cognitions and the emotions of grief through action or through planning. Someone who is more intuitive in their grieving style, they may both internally or externally process, but they do need that sharing. There's a focus on the emotional component and really introspecting on what those feelings are.
Right.
And all of us have some of both. But there can be societal roles that pigeonhole you into being more one or more the other. So when Terry Martin and Ken Doka first talked about instrumental and intuitive grieving, they really mapped it onto sort of masculine and feminine because of the social constructs.
Yeah, right.
They weren't saying, oh, if you're a girl, this is what you do. If this is a boy, this is what you do. That's not what they were saying. They're saying it was a social construct. And the thing is, even though we all have a little bit of both, and they're actually, I look at them as being on a spectrum. They're two parallel spectrum. And you can be at any point on either. And depending on the loss itself, you may have a different composition.
Right.
And so this last form of disenfranchised grief or category of disenfranchised grief is when you are not fitting or being allowed to express what you need or want.
So my Uncle Sonny, I'm Italian on one side. Never knew.
Kidding.
Zampatella never came right. And the English and Irish side. But I kind of grew up Italian. The English and Irish I didn't really grow up with. So my dad's aunts and uncle were basically my aunts and uncle. I grew up with them.
Yep.
So we have Aunt Dolly, Aunt Gloria, Aunt Edie, Aunt Franny, and my grandmother Marie, and my Uncle Sonny. Nice German names, right? So my Uncle Sonny dies from a heart attack at his 50th birthday party. So you've got my Italian side of the family over here on the left-hand side in the funeral room, whatever. And then you've got my mom's English-Irish side over here. These are my aunts. I shit you not. Oh, God.
How could you possibly have taken him away from us? He was a saint. He should have taken me.
2 weeks before, they probably weren't even talking to each other. But this is how it was going to be. My Aunt Gloria, and I'm not lying to you, my Aunt Gloria goes up there and tries to climb into the coffin with Uncle Sonny, and they were going to go, like, she was going down with them. That was it. So my family's like, oh, Gloria, come here, stop this. My mom's side of the family's like, what the is going? Like, and she's like, Kathy, this is why we told you not to marry this man. They're freaking crazy. Right? And I'm sitting here in the middle going, oh man, like, where's the popcorn? Where's the popcorn? And who's right? Because I was young, you know what I mean? I was a teenager. So yeah, and then my aunt later on, maybe about 3 years ago, our patriarch, Aunt Dolly, she grieved and died. And I knew Aunt Gloria was going to go after her. But this time she's, on a walker. So she's like, wait, I'm going to get in. trying to get herself over there and climb. We're like, oh, Gloria, no. And that was all Italian people. So, but it was a very interesting thing to see in the cultural differences. And me looking at like, well, what was going on? I see it in couples a lot.
Yeah.
Where the men and the women in the family, or the two people, not just man and woman, but two different people, partners, grieve in different ways, and having to bring them in and teaching and working with them and being able to communicate with the other person. This is how I grieve. It's different the way that you're grieving. So our grieving styles are incongruent and our coping styles are incongruent. But that doesn't mean they're wrong. I need to recognize yours. You need to recognize me. What do you need from me? This is what I need from myself, and vice versa, so that we can keep this relationship intact and that we can experience each other's grief as being just as valid as the other person's.
Well, and you just brought up the most important point, though. In order to traverse the differences in coping and grieving differences, mm-hmm. you have communication differences.
Mm-hmm. Right. Oh, yeah, definitely. For sure.
And so you have to teach them a common language.
Right.
In order to make that work. And that's the thing with the couple that I mentioned earlier in this podcast. I was a 21-year-old. I just answered phones at a hospital. Like, he was not a bad husband. He came with this woman to almost every appointment. He was fulfilling his role
right.
of being the protector and putting a boundary on the experience and the grief. Mm-hmm. And well, he's not going to expose his wife to the trauma of going through a ritual. He wasn't a jerk.
Right.
Felt jerky, but it wasn't.
Right.
And she was respectful that he was taking that role, and that's why she didn't argue with him. Because I'm projecting a little bit, but we've got some similarity in our personality.
Yeah.
A little Venn diagram going
yeah.
on. Either one of us, if our husbands said, no, you can't grieve that, we'd be like, the heck we can't.
Yeah, exactly.
You may come if you like,
yeah.
but this is what we're doing, right? Mm-hmm. That's our personality.
Right.
But that wasn't her personality.
Sure.
And I didn't mention the fact that they were from two very different cultures.
Oh, so and then there's a lot of overlap there. And obviously then probably different communication styles as well.
Absolutely.
So if we have somebody that's being disenfranchised, because there are certain things being said like, she's no longer in pain, or she was such an angel that God took her away, or you have to be strong.
Can I just hit my head against a wall now?
No, these are all the things. I have an entire list. If anybody's ever interested, I got an entire list of things not to say and an entire list of things to say that you can say.
Can we do a podcast just on that?
Yeah.
I have rebuttals for them.
Oh, yeah. But the whole lived a long life and all these are the things not to say. Things
and to the
say.
Person too.
Yeah, absolutely. But things to say. I'm here for you whenever you need me. I'm just a phone call away. I can only imagine how difficult this must be for you. You will never hear me say, and I said this before, you could have lost your brother exact same way, same age, everything. I will never look at you and say, you know what? I know exactly how you feel. I lost my brother that way too. No, you don't, because there's all the other mitigating circumstances and all yeah. So it's so important to be able to say, if you and for people to learn how to say, I know you're trying to be helpful for me right now. And I appreciate the fact that you are, you care enough about me to say something, but that's not helpful. That's making me shut down. What would be helpful is this. And to give them, that place to, and in therapy, and I know you're not a clinician, but as a clinician, I'll sit there and work with people and we'll role play that as part of, like, how are you going to handle that if you are, being disenfranchised? And how do you recognize when you are disenfranchising yourself? And how do you reframe that so that you can stop doing that and give yourself the compassion you need in order to give yourself the permission to go through? There's a saying I love: joy shared is joy doubled, but grief shared is grief halved. And when you are shutting a person down from being able to grieve, you are making that grief remain private. And we are social beings with the need for social validation. And we started out, talking about that earlier today. And without that ability, whether or not it's by avoiding, contact altogether, or it's saying, Mom, it's been a year, maybe you start dating again. Maybe I haven't even taken my wedding rings off and I have no idea. Are you kidding me? I'm never going to date another person. The way they say things to you, sometimes really overtly ridiculous comments, like the one woman that I worked with. I mean, there's so many different ways it can be disenfranchised. So do you think if somebody is being disenfranchised, opportunities like this podcast, like, first of all, identifying that it is a disenfranchised grief, maybe hearing what can I say instead in reaction to that, do you think those might be helpful steps for somebody?
I do.
Okay.
And I want to touch back on two things you said that I think are really important and could be helpful for people who are listening to a podcast like this one.
Okay.
One is with the idea of that grief halved.
Mm-hmm.
When you are feeling disenfranchised, that grief isn't just contained and retained. It's actually made worse because now you're grieving the loss of a support.
Sure.
You've shut down that line of communication. So it really is important for the person who is grieving to be able to articulate, that's not helping.
Right.
That's hurting.
Right.
When my mom died, got a lot of supportive comments, got some that I'm just going to pretend didn't exist. Mm-hmm. The most validating comment I got, I was at work and this non-clinician researcher came up to me. She's like, yeah, I heard about your mom. What a cluster F.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly it.
It
captured
so
it.
Validating.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not going to say that in case one of my students might see this video, but that phrase,
mm-hmm.
naming it for the upside down disaster of chaos it was perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I needed that. That franchised me.
Right.
And I needed to be validated.
Yeah.
And so things we can do that can be validating, like you said, saying, I can only imagine, saying, I'm trying to understand, owning your humility. I think that's the number one thing for people who are not actively grieving themselves to recognize is be humble. You don't know.
Yeah.
You may have experienced the same type of loss.
That's right.
You haven't experienced that loss with that history, with that relationship,
exactly.
with your own personal baggage, because we've
right.
all got it. So I will say the one thing I hate is when people say, I can't imagine. Baloney. You have imagined, it sucked, and so you're shying away from it.
Okay, gotcha.
And that's the other thing. Sometimes people do the wrong things for the right reason. So when we don't know what to say to the person, what do? We don't call.
Right.
We don't.
The avoidance.
We avoid them. Well, my daughter is getting married and your daughter died 2 years ago.
Right.
I'm not going to invite you to the bridal shower. And let's face it, part of it is because, I really don't want to hurt them. Part of it is because you don't want the person to be a Debbie Downer at the bridal shower.
Yep.
Extend the invitation.
Which may or may not be the case. That's a lot of fortune telling.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. So reach out, extend the invitation, be humble enough to say, please tell me if this isn't what you need right now. And
recognize that if you're having non-death related losses, that they are grievable as well. I think that's going to be a whole other podcast.
We've talked about that.
Definitely.
But yeah, owning the fact that you are allowed to grieve, that it is a loss, that you need to make space for yourself. And again, the hard part about that is you're having to be an advocate at the time you don't have resources to advocate.
Right. Yeah.
But that's the only way forward.
That's right.
And so, in retrospect now, the next time I lose a cat, I'm going to tell my boss. Actually, I have a wonderful boss. But if I had a boss that wasn't, maybe I send them some educational materials.
Here's the thing on pet loss.
Just so you know, you're making it worse.
Yeah. So here we go. Thank you so much. This was a really important topic and complicated topic, but I think one of the not to be no. How can people get a hold of you if they want more information or they want to be your best friend? What can we do?
So, the magic of Google. You can find me online.
Okay.
I'm my full-time position. I'm at the Institutes for Psychological Sciences, which is part of Divine Mercy University. You can also find me. I adjunct for George Mason and for Edgewood College, teaching in their thanatology programs. I do an elective here or there on these topics.
Okay.
And so I'm easy to find.
All right. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time. It's been wonderful and so thorough. I love it. Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Phoenix Rising with Dr. Z. If you found this podcast helpful, please share it, subscribe, and leave a rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. We want to be a resource for anyone who's experiencing loss, and this is a simple way you can help us spread the word. Check out our show description. There you'll find a link to connect with me on social media, as well as helpful articles and resources.